The audio you're about to hear was recorded in Anchor. Learn more at anchor.fm.
Welcome back to episode 012. This is the Alexander Schmidt podcast. Just to immediately address something that a few listeners have expressed to me. The best way to listen to all of these lectures together is to download the Anchor app. A-N-C-H-O-R. You can do it on Google Play or the iTunes Store for free. It's totally free, and it will give you updates on my show, on my lectures when they show up immediately, so that you don't have to go looking or check Facebook or something like that. And if you get into this story in this series of lectures, you may well want to do this because it will just make it easier for you to listen to a show that I'm sure you'll love. Okay, so last time we were talking, we got through book 2 of the Iliad, and then we did some analysis of it as well. We looked at the staff as a symbol, and something interesting about that I didn't mention is that, of course, the one who wields the staff best is not the king in Book 2, but rather Odysseus, and that's particularly interesting, especially the postmodern claim that competency is power. Because in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and all the great books, we'll see that, in fact, that's not true. That often there is a divorce between competency and power, and that, in fact, competency is more valuable than power or strength. We'll see, in fact, our representative of political power and our representative of physical prowess fall prey to their own ignorances and foibles, you might say. Whereas competency, of course, as competency, well, what's competency's weakness? Exactly. It's that which enables you to adapt to any situation, which means that, functionally speaking, competency is true strength and lacks weakness, which is why Odysseus always wins. So, Book 3, what are we going to see? Well, first and foremost, we're going to finally see the Achaeans and the Trojans clash, and we're going to see a dressing down of their ranks and how they look and how they interact as they take the field. We'll then immediately have two representative individuals who surely are showing us what the first thought must have been when the Trojans and the Achaeans came to battle, when they first started battling 10 years ago. And so even though the Trojan War is starting in the 10th year of the war, many of the events will mimic the first events of the war. So we'll hear about, say, for instance, Menelaus, the first man who died, getting hit by a spear. He's actually referenced in the catalog of ships, too, if you want to check on that. And he'll be mentioned, too, again, when Hector breaks through the Achaean wall, which will be built, and sets fire to Aias the Greater's ships. And so in this book, we'll see our first battle, which will mimic the first battle of the Trojans and the Achaeans. We'll see the first single combat, which will be between exactly whom you would expect: Menelaus, the bereaved and the aggrieved by Paris of Troy, and of course his opponent will be Paris of Troy, and the battle will go much as you would expect between, well, frankly, Paris will be described as something of a pretty boy, and we'll get into that description a little bit, and Menelaus is a grim and fierce fighter. And, well, so you might imagine the comparison today would be between a professional mixed martial artist of the highest pedigree in the UFC against, I don't know, somebody in a Ronald McDonald costume. It's just not a fair fight. It's not very close at all. I might add that the random person in the Ronald McDonald costume would not train UFC or in a mixed martial arts capacity with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Judo, wrestling, and such. Right. So, we'll also see Helen for the first time. We'll see the woman who launched 1,000 ships, and, well, just see a little bit of her character, because she may be different from what you might expect. She's in no way air-headed or lacking in mind. She's incredibly perceptive, and something we'll notice here in Book 3 is that she, unlike any other mortal, seems to have the ability to recognize gods by their specific features when they mimic the look of mortals. She's just so perceptive that she can see something which is imperceptible, is essentially the idea. And she'll learn a little bit of bad news, which she won't at the moment know is bad news, but really is. And the book will end with a sort of unholy and undeserved wedding of sorts, you might say. It's not an actual wedding, but you might say that it is not an actual wedding in the respect that Paris and Helen are not actually wedded, which is an interesting question my students often ask me about. They say, well, how can Paris marry Helen if she's already married to Menelaus? And, well, I think that's quite a fine question. Regardless of the laws of a land, how can a woman be married to two men at once from different countries, from different lands, embodying two ideals? So one perhaps begins to see what Helen represents. Perhaps a person who abandons one ideal for another and conflict that ensues. So let's jump in. Two armies, the troops in divisions, under their commanders. The Trojans advancing across the plain. Here comes a very famous Homeric simile. And Homeric similes are similes of extended length, which often involve gruesome animal scenes. So often boars, lions, cranes, snakes, eagles will make their way into Homer's similes. Often there will be combat within the similes, and something to look out for is that the savagery of nature is certainly represented in the savagery of human nature, and during a battle, especially a physical battle during an ancient war, well, man and animal are not so hard to distinguish. And so Homer reminds us of this. In the Lombardo translation, taking it from line 4, like cranes beating their metallic wings in the stormy sky at winter's onset, unspeakable rain at their backs, their necks stretched toward oceanic streams and down to strafe the brown pygmy race, bringing strife and bloodshed from the sky at dawn, the Trojans advancing across the plain. So something to notice about the Trojans differing from the Achaeans, and this is something I mentioned back in the first lecture on the Iliad, is that the Trojans, like a flock of birds, are extremely loud, clashing, screaming into the sky to try to intimidate the Achaeans. The Achaeans, you'll soon find, are grim, fierce, and silent. Their dispositions, even as armies, are completely different. Just as the gods who help each side are completely different. And someone might notice that from God on high down to the behavioral level at the lowest possible level, the Achaeans will find themselves superior to the Trojans. And so what you are to keep your mind focused on is when you see a virtue of the Achaeans, do not question why it is that the Achaeans have the virtues, because of course they're the archetypal winners, but rather what it is that virtue has to teach you and what it is you could accomplish more by embodying that virtue. And so the first one will be the difference between that which is superficial and that which is substantial. I'll continue now with the description of the Achaeans. Banks of mist, or rather, while the Greeks moved forward in silence, their breath curling in long, angry plumes that acknowledged their pledges to die for each other, the simile begins. Banks of mist settle on mountain peaks and seep into the valleys. Shepherds dislike it, but for a thief it is better than night. And a man can only see as far as he can throw a stone. So we see, confirmed, that the Achaeans, called Greeks by Lombardo to upset me, we notice that the Achaeans, in their silence, are compared to thieves. but thieves who are entering an environment that plays to their advantage. And why would the Achaeans be compared to thieves? Well, the Achaeans are plundering pirates as far as the Trojans are concerned. They are come to another land to take back something which is theirs, but also everything else. It's not just Helen that the Achaeans have come to claim at this point. They'll be taking everything. Though the question of whether the Achaeans would leave with less will be broached. But ultimately the outcome will be a negative one. And the Achaeans will utterly destroy the Trojans. And that will be a theme that we pick up again in the Iliad directly, and a theme that we discuss obliquely in a way, at least compared to the Iliad, in the Odyssey. Of course, the Odyssey will deal with the after effects, the memories, the traumas of Troy, the effects on the men, their families, the world, after their actions have determined the course of history. Whereas the Aeneid will actually deal with the Trojans who have to survive and find a new home, and that will be none too easy a task for them either. So if the Odyssey shows the hardest path possible in life, well, then the Aeneid shows something even harder, which is, well, that's the sort of incredible thing humans have always had to do. And so as the Achaeans and the Trojans meet on the field of battle, Paris shows up in a leopard skin. And something I always mention when lecturing about this is that a leopard skin would have been none too common a thing to wear and would have surely indicated his noble status. It indicates that he can hunt, and that he has the leisure time to hunt, and that he's a talented hunter. But it's a leopard, so not with a dagger, but with a bow. Not with a spear, but with a bow. So he's a bowman. You know this. And he's not wearing any armor. Well, what does that tell you? That tells you that he's arrogant, that he's foolish, that he's superficial, that he's stupid, that he's careless. Because everybody wears armor. And especially the people that actually fight. And so what do you immediately know about him? That he's only there for the get-go, and that he won't finish. Because the real fighters are ready for a fight. And he's ready just to put on a show. And so he steps out in front of the Trojan ranks, and Menelaus catches a sight of him. And you might imagine that this is like Menelaus seeing a hot fudge sundae in front of himself after 12 hours of starvation. Because what more could Menelaus want to see in the midst of a battle than the object of all his hate and all Achaean hate present itself right in front of him? It must have felt like a gift from Zeus in that moment to him. And in fact, I imagine, though it does not say here, that he must have prayed and been thankful for that opportunity. And just to add emphasis to that point, to the food metaphor and the consummatory reward system mentioned earlier, here's actually the simile that describes Menelaus stalking Paris. Lines 27 to 31 in the Lombardo, Book 3. As a lion must feel when he finds the carcass of a stag or a wild goat and half-starving consumes it greedily, even though hounds and hunters are swarming down on him. And so I don't know if I got caught off there, but what I was saying was that Menelaus saw what was essentially the best thing he could possibly see, and we understand that because we use the metaphor of, or rather a simile of, a wild animal half-starved eating a carcass of prey it would love to eat, which is, according to our representational capacity, the best thing we can possibly imagine. And that's why we interpret that sort of thing. Paris then gets described as seeing Menelaus, and this is how he reacts. Paris's blood turned milky when he saw him coming on, pale, and he faded back into the Trojan troops with cheeks as pale as if he had almost stepped on a poisonous snake in a mountain pass. Wow. I mean, just think about that. Just upon seeing Menelaus, Paris turns completely white, almost green, like somebody who almost steps on a snake, barely notices it, and jumps out of the way and thinks about what? How close to death they just were. Well, you might well say, well, that's understandable that he would be so scared of death. And I might well just say back to you, however, they're both soldiers in war. The expectation is that they're both prepared for death. The reality is that Paris certainly is not. And so his brother Hector sees him, and he speaks to him as scornfully as he possibly can. And you should understand that Hector has every right to do this. Hector is running the Trojan war efforts. He is the chieftain. He is correlate essentially to Agamemnon in his capacities, because his father Priam, as emperor of Troy, he's too old, so he can't go out and be a marshal of the people. Hector has a wife, he has a son, and he is the firstborn of Priam, so he will have the kingdom as well. He has every responsibility. Paris has none. And Hector has never, ever dishonored Troy. And has been a perfect son, dutiful in every way, and we'll see that in Book 6 and in Book 24 in much sadder form. Paris, all he ever did was get banished from Troy due to a prophecy that suggested that he would destroy Troy someday, just to come back one day with Helen of Sparta, and then to be followed by 1,000 Achaean ships that would destroy his people. They're the opposite sorts of guys. The sort that fix things, and the sort that break things. And so when Hector speaks to Paris, he has something to say. Paris, you desperate, womanizing, pretty boy. Lombardo translation, everybody. I wish you had never been born, or had died unmarried. Better that than this disgrace before the troops. Can't you just hear it? The long-haired Greeks chuckling and saying that our champion wins for good looks, but comes up short on offense and defense. Is this how you were when you got up a crew and sailed overseas, hobnobbed with the warrior caste in a foreign country, and sailed off with a beautiful woman with marriage ties to half of them? You're nothing but trouble for your father and your city, a joke to your enemies, an embarrassment to yourself. No, don't stand up to Menelaus. You might find out what kind of a man it is whose wife you're sleeping with. You think your lyre will help you? Or Aphrodite's gifts? Your hair? Your pretty face when you sprawl in the dust? It's the Trojans who are cowards. Or do you have long since been dressed out in stones for all the harm you've done? Now I have to say, being the sort of person who becomes a teacher of great books and great literature, and having also a podcast, you might imagine that I'm the sort of person that's talked far too much during the entirety of his life, and therefore been punished for it. Often with brutal verbal assaults that were completely deserved. Yes. And yet, nothing I have ever said or had said to me has ever come anywhere close to what Hector said to his own brother just now. But you should hear Paris' response. Because apparently, even the dagger of truth has no effect on whatever armor it is that he has, which isn't real armor, of course. That's only just, Hector. You've got a mind like an axe, always sharp. Making the skilled cut through a ship's beam, multiplying force. Nothing ever turns your edge. But don't throw golden Aphrodite's gifts in my face. We don't get to choose what the gods give us, And we can't just toss their gifts aside. He's mentioning how beautiful he is and the fact that women love him, by the way, when he says that. So, all right, if you want me to fight. Fine. Have the Trojans and the Greeks sit down, and Menelaus and I will square off in the middle to fight for Helen and all her possessions. Winner take all. And everyone else will swear oaths of friendship. You all to live here in the fertile Troad, and they to go back to bluegrass Argos and Achaea with its beautiful women. Hector liked what he heard. This line's about 65 to 80. Okay, so what did we just hear? Well, Paris is completely unabashed by what has been said to him by Hector. He doesn't mind at all, and in fact he has the impudence to speak back to Hector, his brother, his superior in every way, and say, well, man, don't hate me because I'm beautiful. I'm so good looking, and, that's not me, that's Aphrodite. And so maybe this whole war is because of Aphrodite and not because of Paris, is the implication there. And we can't actually address that. The mythology does suggest that Aphrodite has a major part to play in how the Trojan War starts. There's a whole sub-story that I may tell at some point about the Apple of Eris and how that leads to the judgment of Paris. And Paris will choose between the beauty of 3 goddesses, and all will cheat and offer him something. They will all attempt, knowing his lowly human nature and his subject to desire, they will attempt to goad him with bribes, and he will be offered political power by Hera. He will not accept it. Victory in battles and war by Athena. He doesn't care much for that. And the most beautiful woman imaginable by Aphrodite. And fool that he is, he imagines it is she that he will be with. But no. It's Helen. She's beautiful enough. It will just happen to be the case that she's taken. And so for his selfish love, which reminds me very much of the crown and Queen Elizabeth's uncle, for his selfish love, his entire people would fall. In any case, though, he makes a suggestion, a brash suggestion, indicating his superficial understanding of the situation and the consequences of it. He looks for the quick fix, a quick fix that will fix nothing for him and everything for everybody else, because he suggests that he fight Menelaus one-on-one. Everybody will agree to this. Why? Well, the Trojans hate Paris just as much as the Achaeans do, if not more. They love Hector. He's good. He's noble. He represents everything good about them. They hate Paris. He's lowly. He's chosen one woman from a foreign land over all his people. He's the worst. So they would love him to die. And then the Achaeans will go away, and they can be happy again, and he'll be gone, which means they'll actually possibly be even happier than before. The Achaeans want him dead for obvious reasons, then they win, go home, and they're good. And actually, the terms of the agreement to this one-on-one combat will stipulate that Paris will only give back Helen the things she stole from Sparta, because they did steal things as well, and some additional recompense for their time at the war. But, that's not so much. That's not that bad, honestly. It indicates, really, that there's not a lot of hate between the Trojans and the Achaeans specifically. In fact, you won't really even hear about that sort of emotion being applied to battle. Well, hate will stand on Odysseus' ship at one point. And, well, there is a certain hate that the men seem to have for each other while they fight, but not a personal one in any way. We won't see a personal hate, really. We won't see somebody take it personally until Menelaus retakes the field against Hector. And, well, he just takes the situation completely out of context. And you might understand Menelaus to be the sort of person, like Lucifer, who manages to make every situation about himself. And how everything that happens to everybody when it happens to him is the biggest deal ever, and he doesn't know how to deal with it. And why? Well, he's called half divine. You might also understand that to mean that he's a prima donna, which would also be indicated by the fact that he's so close to his mother, who's always there with him. And you might also understand, when you consider the fact that Athena loves Odysseus, that she's often with him, but that Thetis is often with Achilles. What is Thetis? She's the overgiving mother. She gives too much. She spoils him. He's the worst. But Odysseus is pushed by Athena. In fact, at the end of the Odyssey, which he will be at because he survives Troy, unlike Achilles. Even then, in his hardest battle, Athena will require him to prove himself before she joins and helps him out. And that's what wisdom demands of somebody. That they go into uncharted, unmapped territory. And once there, boom, wisdom activates. If you're going to have any chance, it's with her. And that's exactly the argument that Athena will make at the end of the Odyssey. And so, in a way we covered a lot of ground today, and another way we covered much less than I expected. We find ourselves now with a one-on-one combat about to occur between Menelaus and Paris. And one last note before we do go, actually, is that do recall that Paris is the one who tells Paris is the one that tells Hector to stop the fighting. And so Hector's the one that has to go out into the middle of the field and risk his neck in order to stop the fighting. And you might imagine that a spear and a rock could still be thrown at him, and there's major risk in doing that. That's very brave of him to do that. And of course, that's not something Paris would do. And so, next time I lecture, we'll get through this battle between Paris and Menelaus. And we'll see the Takeoscopia, the view from the wall, so-called, where Helen and Priam take a look at all the Achaean warriors and notice those who are distinguishable or distinct from the others. And then we'll see the devolving nature of Paris and Helen's relationship because, well, apparently being a coward doesn't make one a big hit anywhere. So we'll do our best to get through Book 3 in episode 013. This has been episode 012. Remember, download Anchor. Make sure you like my station. Share it, talk about it, call in anytime. If you ever have any questions about anything I say or if I need to correct something. In fact, I think I heard something earlier where I said a not when I shouldn't have said not, and so that's the nature of on-air broadcasts, I imagine. So, like, share, download Anchor. And next week, I will be going live onto iTunes. And I may have a new image to go with that, too. Tune in.
The audio you just heard was recorded in Anchor. Learn more at anchor.fm. The audio you're about to hear was recorded in Anchor. Learn more at anchor.fm.
Welcome to the Alexander Schmid podcast, episode 013, Homer's Iliad, Book 3, Part 2. Last time we were talking, we jumped into the intro to Book 3. We talked some about the strife between Menelaus and Paris. We talked a little bit about their differing attires and their differing mentalities and what that represents about the Achaeans and the Trojans at large. We noted the first Homeric similes. We noted that humans become less distinguishable, not more distinguishable, as I think I accidentally said, from animals yesterday. So humans become more like animals during the war and thus bear more descriptive similarity to them through the Homeric similes. Often there'll be lions, boars, birds of prey, and occasionally they'll do some very interesting things. Something that's often mentioned as a rather funny note is that the lions are sometimes described as biting the heads off of creatures and then gulping down their blood, because there was an ancient belief that that's how lions ate. And, well, I think that just bears some wisdom that they didn't know lions well enough to know how lions would rip their limbs off, and so that's great. And so I find that funny and interesting to hear. So, today, what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to start with a small correction. When Hector walked out onto the battlefield at the request of his cowardly brother, Paris, yesterday, I said that you should imagine that this was an act of bravery on his part, because stones and spears could still be thrown at him. Well, in fact, they were. If we look at lines 80 to 85 or so, in Book 3, we see in the Lombardo translation again, and I promise I will get the Lattimore at some point, but I often leave it at school. Hector liked what he heard. He went out in front along the Trojan ranks, holding a spear broadside, and made them all sit down. Greek archers and slingers were taking aim at him, and already starting to shoot arrows and stones, when Agamemnon boomed out a command for them to hold their fire. Hector was signaling that he had something to say, and his helmet caught the morning sun as he addressed both armies. He shines like a star, essentially. But what you for sure notice there is that the Greek archers were already shooting at Hector, so he really had to take a risk in order to stop the battle, but it is to his best interest and to the best interests of both camps. And I don't know that I closed that argument yesterday. Why is Paris offering to fight against Menelaus a win-win for everybody? Because everybody knows Paris will lose. Even if Paris won, that would be a win for everybody. But Paris will clearly lose, because Menelaus is so much better than Paris, and that is a win for Troy, and that is a win for the Achaeans, because they get to go home and they get the spoils, and the Trojans get to continue living, and they have the most shameful person who caused the war killed. It would be a major victory for them to see Paris die without any additional bloodshed. And every single one of them is aware of that, by the way, as they would be. So, Agamemnon stops the Achaeans from firing. Hector comes forward. Hector gives Paris his challenge out along the battlefield. Hear me, Achaeans. This is a paraphrase. My brother Paris calls Menelaus to arms to fight for the hand of Helen. Winner take all. Loser go along his way, and there be no bonds of enmity remaining amongst the Trojans and the Achaeans. Menelaus immediately accepts, and the war will be over after one of these men dies. And, well, this does seem like a personal conflict, being as one of these men stole the wife of another, and so it does seem very reasonable that a duel amongst the two of them, rather than a massive war between two peoples, occur. And so they prepare to fight. But before they fight, we get something of an episode shift, a scene shift. We find ourselves for the first time in Troy, above the wall, where the elders are sitting together, Priam and Antenor in particular. Antenor, who will give his name to Antenora in the Inferno. And so Priam, sometimes called Priam by those with more British proclivities, he summons, well, first he's talking with Antenor, and he summons Helen, as he must have summoned her when the Achaeans first showed. And he asks her for a description of the men. But something I always share with my students, and what I would like to share with you, is something I would say is sort of funny. As Helen is walking towards these two old men, and they're now very old, and Priam has by legend, 19 children, I think even sons, by his wife Hecuba. Andromache is Hector's wife. But also 31 other ones. And I think $50 as well, because it said that he has 50 halls for his daughters and their husbands. So he's been fairly productive with his life, and one might imagine that the beauty of Helen would have lost its effect on someone who had been so successful. And so, well, that's not the case at all. Actually, Priam and Antenor sort of devolve into sort of joking, churlish young men. And, well, such were the voices of these Trojan elders, sitting on the tower by the western gate. When they saw Helen coming, their rasping whispers flew along the wall. You notice that they feel the need to whisper. Who could blame either the Trojans or Greeks for suffering so long for a woman like this? Her eyes are not human. And then, also, whatever she is, let her go back with the ships and spare us and our children a generation of pain. And so, a couple things there. First thing is that you notice that her beauty is not lost on anybody, and even the people you would most expect beauty to be lost on, especially in an erotic fashion like that, it's not. That's how beautiful Helen is. So we should keep that in mind when we judge Paris and not be overly hasty, because apparently what Helen sort of represents for him is the conflict between culture and nature. Because on the one hand, he should be above his brutish nature and forget about Helen, because she will cause his people to die, which is bad because he's a prince. But on the other hand, in terms of nature, she's the most beautiful woman who exists, and therefore confers the highest status which can exist to Paris, he who is with the person whom every man desires. And so, from a natural, biological level, he's very much conflicted with his cultural duties. Even though if he thought it through, evolutionarily speaking, it doesn't matter how beautiful she is if they all die because of the Achaeans. Well, perhaps this shows just how powerful nature can be, that he chooses against reason and his own people because of the imposition of the effect of nature on him and his utter amazement in its wake. But then perhaps we'll see other examples of individuals like Hector who can somehow rise above that. And perhaps another open question you might be asking is, does this draw a parallel between Paris, who is subject to his desire, and Achilles, who is subject to his rage? And I would say that perhaps you'll see a parallel to any person who becomes overcome emotionally in this text. And surrounding the text, Aias the Greater's actions afterwards, and certainly Agamemnon will find himself subject to emotion on multiple occasions and act in accordance with it, and be lucky enough to have brave and noble advisors who will steer him towards the middle way, you might say, a less extreme way. Something Agamemnon's going to do is he's basically going to suggest that the Achaeans run away multiple times in earnest, as opposed in conjunction with the time he suggested in jest from yesterday. So, Helen is summoned to Priam, and something about Priam is that he's very gracious to Helen, just as Hector is. And in fact, Helen will explicitly say at Hector's funeral that he was the only man that was ever always nice to her. And you might consider him as the person who has everything to blame her from, because she will result in the death of his wife, son, mother, all of his good brothers, even his bad brother, and his kingdom. Oh, and his child too, of course, in very dramatic fashion. Astyanax. and yet he's kind to her. And so perhaps he shows the opposite of Paris in that though he has every natural reason to see her as a threat and as something worthy of disgust, he treats her like a human instead. Perhaps that's what Paris and nobody else does. They treat her as a figure of the feminine rather than as an individual. And you noticed the attention being drawn to her eyes. Well, her eyes are incredible because they see so much, which means that she has an extraordinary individuality and not simply sort of the soulless generality that one sees in a Greek statue, now deprived of the painting on their eyes with those vacant stares they have. And so all the more tragic that she finds herself locked within this role of representing the eternally sought-after feminine when she is so incredibly individual and capable of such differentiated thought and perception. She'll even show this in her administering of Egyptian drugs in the Odyssey, which essentially suggests that she's acquired the wisdom of the Egyptians, which means, as far as the Greeks were concerned, she's received the most ancient wisdom that exists, which means, well, she's very wise. So Priam, he invites Helen over, and he makes sure to say to her explicitly that he doesn't blame her for this war, but he blames the gods, and that's a very kind thing for him to say, because he's the only person who says that. As you heard from the whispers, everywhere Helen goes, people talk about two things: how beautiful she is, her eyes, and the fact that they wish she wasn't there. So she gets negative emotion everywhere she goes, even though she's so beautiful, thus suggesting the question that would one really want to be that beautiful at all? And perhaps if you think of Achilles as an exemplar of being that strong, would you want to be that strong given how he acts? And if you take Agamemnon as an example of being extraordinarily wealthy and you see how he acts, you might wonder whether that's something you really want too. So, Priam sits with Helen, says he doesn't blame her. Oh yeah, about her eyes, just to mention that very quickly. The reason why her eyes are so focused on, besides the fact that she's perceptive, is that she's obviously always looking around because she sees people whispering wherever she goes, which makes her highly alert and attentive. And so she really does have the most brutal mistress to her wisdom, because it is through the negative effect she has on others, and therefore their threatened glares that they give to her, that she learns the wisdom of people and how people turn on you due to the, well, in this case, due to the decisions you make. That's something that Paris seems to be fairly immune to. You might imagine that nobody likes him either, and yet, well, he's got Helen, so he seems to be fine. Okay, so Priam asks about the Achaeans. And, well, as you might expect, who does he see first? Well, he sees the man that looks most kingly, just like him. He sees exactly through the lenses that he's always worn. Priam is king. He looks for the king. Who does he see? The most royal-looking man. And Helen, she says, well, that is a good fighter. And king, that is Agamemnon. And so the next thing you might imagine is, who is it next a king would look for? And you might imagine that that would be answered by the fact that Zeus, king of the gods, bore Athena from his own mind, which means that she is the implementer of his strategies in the world, even though she explicitly serves Hera. But you'll understand that that means that Athena ensures that Hera's plans are in accordance with Zeus. Though perhaps that won't always be the case in the Iliad. We'll have to keep our eyes open for that sort of talk. Perhaps that's a theory. So, who is the equivalent to Athena on Earth on the Achaean side? Well, that would be the most cunning of the Achaeans, though. The most actively intelligent, well, that's Odysseus. And he's described as a ram amongst sheep. That means a man amongst women. That means that he's moving more, that he's bigger, that he's more active, that he looks more dominant. There's something about him that rings dominance. And what is that? That he's aware. He's keeping track of everything that's happening. He's clearly full of potency because he's using it in those moments. And in this moment, Antenor, greatest advisor to Priam, parallel to Nestor, he decides to pipe up and he says, "Oh, Odysseus. Oh, yes. I remember when Odysseus and Menelaus first came here, when the ships first came and they demanded Helen back." And so when they came, it was interesting because there was the one man, Menelaus, he tall, red-headed, broad-shouldered man, and then Odysseus, a little shorter, broader shoulders, like a wrestler. And Menelaus, he spoke very intelligently when he spoke to us and demanded Helen back, and we all approved of how he spoke. But as he spoke, we saw this Odysseus fellow, and he was just holding his staff and staring at the floor, and we all thought he looked rather dumb. We thought frankly, he looked like an idiot. And but when he spoke, his words were as soft and as sweet as falling snow. So how gentle is falling snow to the touch, and how beautiful is it as it covers a yard or a mountainside? It is of apex level beauty, like staring at the stars from a canyon. And so what is being said of Odysseus' intelligence, the thought he puts into his speech and his manner of speech? That it is masterful in all ways. And so we see again that the capacity for ordered speech is held in high regard, the highest regard, by those who were the Achaeans and by Homer as well. And so next, Aias the Greater is described. And you might understand that his description applies to Achilles too. He's tallest and most beautiful, and is just a real physical specimen. And so you might imagine that the order in which Priam sees these men illustrates the rank that these men hold in the eyes of a king, perhaps even the eyes of the gods, because, well, the king rules and is therefore most important, and that's the reasoning of Nestor, and that's obviously the reasoning of Olympus and the world, because they have kings at that time. King equals most important person. But most important ability is not possessed by the king, but rather by someone like an Odysseus. And Odysseus, you'll notice, is not simply some advisor, but he's an active agent within the world. He's just someone who gets things done. If you have ever seen a James Bond movie, it's like the number 2 to a villain that you see running around, like the guy who threw the hat. That kind of guy. Though I wouldn't say that he and Odysseus look exactly the same. Odysseus didn't wear a suit. And so the greatest ability seems to be wielded by somebody lower in rank than the king. The king has to exist in order to be king, to be the most important person in the society, but that doesn't mean that he has to have many abilities. Obviously he needs to lead effectively well, but he needs people on the ground producing and working hard to maintain the stability of his unity, of his unified force. And Odysseus is the one who does that. And he does it with actions and with words. And in fact, his words are so persuasive that they're like actions because they move other people. They're motivating. And the third greatest thing you need, well, you need some big, strong guy. Or some big, strong amount of guys at your back. And then, boom, you can win. And something to say about the difference in sizes between the Achaeans and the Trojans is. And so, again, not sorry if we got cut off. We were saying that Agamemnon, in insisting that Priam come down to make an agreement with him rather than accepting Hector's agreement, he both insults Hector, asserts his superior rank to Hector, and asserts that he is, like Priam, of rank of king. And something about Priam is that Priam is a king of many nations at this moment because he summoned the allies of the Trojans and they all listened to him. In fact, there are the Dardanians there who are subject to Aeneas, and there are the Lycians who are subject to Sarpedon, and there are many different languages spoken amongst the Trojans because of their Asiatic origins. And so, Agamemnon, in suggesting that he is of that high rank, possibly has something to do with the genesis of the nation of Greece, or Hellas, as a whole. And so in the next episode, we'll finally get down to the fight between Paris and Menelaus and see the outcome, see the after effects, and get to see a little marital tiff between Paris and Helen. This has been the Alexander Schmidt Podcast. Please download the Anchor app. Make sure to subscribe to my show, share it, call in. And I'm loving this, and I'm looking forward to finishing Book 3 with you. Have a great day.
Hi, Mr. Schmid. I had a few ideas as I was listening to this one, and they keep kind of escaping, so I'll try to say them before they get away again. One of them had to do with the symbol of the staff. I liked how he talked about the tree and that, and I was thinking about my own classes in school, in middle school or somewhere along the line. We read a book where the symbol wasn't a staff, but it was a conch shell. Lord of the Flies, that's it. And in Lord of the Flies, the kids are stuck on the island, and they know that they need to have some kind of order, so they organically, create this hierarchy among themselves where they pass the conch shell around. And I was interested what you thought about that as an image, where it's sort of this, instead of a tree, it's something that comes out of the ocean. Instead of a phallic image, it's a lot more feminine image. Thinking about those Georgia O'Keeffe paintings, it's that same kind of image, and it's one that comes about out of the children themselves rather than from a top-down kind of oppressive mentality. And the other thing that this episode made me think about, when you're talking about the Platonic dialogue and the poet, the rhapsode, that struck a chord, because hearing about these kinds of stories, I always want to compare, I guess, two kinds of ways of talking about stories. Where on the one hand you have the pure kind of storyteller. You might think idealized as the rhapsode there. He tells the story without really thinking about what it means, or if he does think about it, it's not in a very analytic kind of way, right? And then on the other hand, you have the other extreme where maybe it's like a lecturer in a college or something who knows the story very well, but doesn't really tell the story. They sort of just analyze the story. They pick it apart and they tell you a lot of things about the story and all the context and maybe all the symbols, right? So the conch shell, it's one of the first, symbols that we seize upon learning to read in school or whatever. And I'm interested in what you think about that as like a spectrum, two extremes. On the one hand, the pure storytelling, on the other extreme, the analytic, talking about the story. And where you fall within that, right? You're sort of telling the story, but along the way you're expounding upon the... Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. This machine, this anchor thing, I can't really seem to get it to work very well, but hopefully this gets to you, and hopefully you have some thoughts about it, and the conversation continues. I'm looking forward to the next episodes of your podcast, and take care.
Welcome back to the Alexander Schmidt Podcast. This is episode 014. We're going to take a quick moment here to step away from the story and answer a call-in question. A friend of mine from graduate school, Wesley Shantz, who's been a teacher for longer than I have, called in. He had two major questions to share with me. So I'll include his call in, which I think is, well, if he starts a station, you may want to listen to him. His call in is very, 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 very smart. His questions are, I think, very deep, well-founded, creative, and intelligent. And so in addressing them, I wish to confer my highest gratitude not only for receiving such wonderful questions, but also for having a friend who can ask such questions. So, first off, the conch shell. The conch shell is used by those in Lord of the Flies. So, first and foremost, I should make a confession, and since I'm not a traditional literature teacher, I don't particularly care about this fact, but I never had the opportunity to read Lord of the Flies, or rather, I've never made the time to. I'm sure it's a perfectly good book, and I understand the basic premise about it and its claims about the state of nature. And, perhaps if somebody asked me to, I would read it and analyze it, but I just haven't had the time to. However, as a symbol, I agree with you. A symbol, a conch shell from the sea, well, that indicates femininity at several different levels. The first one is that it comes from the sea, Maria, like Virgin Mary. That is the primordial mother from which all things came, both in mythology and scientifically speaking. And as we know from recent research, there's a major confluence or consilience happening with these fields of study, which is deeply interesting. And I know you're very familiar with this in the work of Dr. Jordan B. Peterson and Ray Kurzweil and some of the cognitive developmental theorists that are doing some good work right now and practically applying it. So, the conch shell is a feminine symbol because it comes from the sea. It's also a feminine symbol because it acts as a shelter or protection or home for another creature. And in so embodying the home, well, what does a woman do? Well, she embodies the first home of man or woman, of anything. And so woman in housing man acts out the same role as earth housing man, or all natural things which create. So any house of something is by nature a feminine symbol. And third, well, what can come out of a conch shell? Well, you can pour water out of it. What does that mean? Well, water flowing out from nature represents wisdom, because it's the natural progression of all things, something following its natural path. And so just as, say, a river follows its natural stream down, unless it's a Nile, so does the wise human follow his destiny, though he must use his choice to do so. And of course, because he uses his choice, he will make frequent errors. And perhaps you might say that that's what the bends and rivers and the crannies sort of represent. And one, I imagine, hopes to be the sort of river that makes it to the ocean, and not one that ends up simply in a lake or a crag or especially a swamp. And so it strikes me that the symbol there reflects the wisdom you're supposed to share when you're in sort of a seminar environment or a conversational environment with those around you. And because of that, it indicates a certain democracy to me, a democratic element that's missing from the staff. Because the staff indicates a hierarchical society. Even though he who wields the staff is not necessarily the one who wields it best, as we've seen mounting evidence for as we go through the Iliad, even only to Book 3. We see Odysseus over and over again inscribing things, using words, tools, and methods more effectively than even Agamemnon or anybody else. And his glories are just going to keep mounting quietly to his name as he effectively wields that source of power. So I would say that the conch shell is both a feminine symbol as opposed to a masculine symbol. It's a more democratic symbol as opposed to a hierarchical symbol, and that it's a symbol of unity in an egalitarian respect in terms of sharing one's wisdom, whereas the staff is a symbol of totality and unity, but in a far more masculine and hierarchically ordered way. So on to your second question. You mentioned the two modes of storytelling that are at the very least alluded to, but really borne out in Plato's Ion, that of telling the story in a creative sort of way and of analyzing as well. The moment you said that, it reminded me of a passage in William James in his two-volume set of The Principles of Psychology. And in one of the chapters entitled Reasoning, he considers the subject of genius. And on the subject of genius, he divides the types of genius into two. The intuitive type, capable of making wide-ranging analogies and of creative potential. In fact, he actually does cite and quote Homer here, which I think is a beautiful bit of synchronicity, or something more. And he contrasts the intuitive mode of genius with the analytical or drier mode, as he calls it. And he in fact makes the argument that some might make the argument that the analytical mode of reasoning is higher than the intuitive because it is newer in terms of cognitive function. Intuitions, of course, are basic recognitions of patterns that Carl Jung, at the very least, says would have been a primitive form of thought, which would eventually develop in the more rational functions of thinking and feeling. And if you read Ray Kurzweil and his most recent book on how to build a brain, he talks about the fact that the brain is essentially created to observe patterns, which I would say is basic intuition, but that analytical reasoning is much harder because that's not what it's built to do. But to answer your question, I would agree with that general distinction, and I would also mention the last thing William James says. He says, yes, there are these two modes of genius. However, there are special cases where they get mixed. And he gives, of course, the epic ancient example of Plato. And then he gives a more modern example of somebody with whom I have no familiarity called M. Taine. And I'd actually be very interested to know who that person is to be worthy of what I would consider essentially the highest distinction possible from William James. And, well, if you were to ask me what my project is and why I deliver in the method I do, I would say, on the one hand, it's just what's always made sense to me. I had very little training when I went into teaching, so I just did what I did, and this is what has happened. I have since received a license and a credential, but I would say that with all the classes I took, they did very little to affect my style of teaching, and they did zero to affect my content. So, when you draw those poles and you say that this might be something in the middle, I would say that that is exactly what we are aiming at right now. We are taking the bow of Apollo and aiming it at truth through art. So the idea is to express accurately and well the story with feeling and emotion in it as it would have been told, while also taking special moments apart in order to show just how special they are, to add to the richness of the experience. You might imagine that this is an abstraction on a wine tasting or a coffee tasting for connoisseurs. All people who exist, especially people who speak the same language, inhabit the same modes of thinking to some extent or another. Many of those modes of thought are based on more primitive or earlier versions of the same thoughts. And so the Iliad is basically the same story we've all ever heard, with slightly different characters, slightly different accents, slightly different clothing, and slightly different events. But in so unpacking the episode, and also providing the emotion which we can still connect to, we see ourselves in it. And we see, importantly, the ways in which we'll always be the same. And then, just as importantly, the ways in which we differ, which we don't care for. And so, in seeing the virtues of the past, which we continue to this day to admire, we have the opportunity to see that which we would like to embody as admirable ourselves. And so, if a person from today, for example, were to feel disenchanted and disheartened by his or her surroundings, he or she might have the opportunity then, following the ways of the ancients, or whomever they admire to bring something into the world that he or she wishes had been there all along, and which perhaps, at least potentially, had. And so that would be my response to your two questions. The last thing I would mention is that you mentioned at the end you seem to get a little bit upset with the anchor technology, and I would say that I too have not mastered the anchor technology. I've been cut off on the last two podcasts of mine. It is a little clumsy, and I totally agree. And well, just please keep calling in. Also, I would like to tell listeners that before I gave this response to Wes, he agreed to appear on the show. And in the next few days, we're going to have a conversation 30 minutes to an hour long, maybe a little longer or a little shorter, depending on whether we have much to say or not. And we're going to hash out some of these issues together. This has been the Alexander Schmidt Podcast, episode 014, addressing Wes's questions. Thank you.
The audio you just heard was recorded in Anchor. Learn more at anchor.fm.